Welcome back to my next episode. I'm changing it up a little bit because I've been asked several times during this recovery process how, at over 75 years old, I ended up with the strength and the wherewithal to recover from all this. So, what is in me that continues this fight? What gives me the drive to recover from this and not give up or get depressed? Looking at that point in time where I know I'm going to be recovered and I know that, life is going to get much more back to normal and I won't be in this wheelchair any longer and I won't be, wearing a diaper any longer and I won't be unable to pee and just there are a lot of things still wrong with me. There are a lot of things that I've got to overcome. So what is it about me when I think about it that has given me the tools to engage in this recovery to the degree that I am? Well, I thought about this and I thought, you know what? I need to tell this story. It's not a story that everybody knows about me. I guess some of my closest friends and family know the story or bits and pieces of the story, but I'm going to tell the whole story in this episode. I think that I got my will to survive and my ability to overcome difficult obstacles because of what happened to me when I was 10 years old. When I was 10 years old, I fell off a 75-foot cliff in Frankfort, Kentucky, and shattered my right femur into, I don't know how many pieces, but a lot. And I was stuck in the bottom of a ravine that dropped into a creek bed for hours. It was very cold. I was not prepared for this. I didn't know this was going to happen, but it did. And all I know is that at 10 years old, I figured out how to survive this. And I did, obviously. So this is not funny. It's not going to make you laugh. I will be trying to do that in future episodes, but this one hopefully will give you some background on me and maybe why I'm able to survive this ordeal that I'm in all these years later, when I survived an ordeal that in some ways was worse when I was only 10 years old. Here's my story. It was January. It was cold. We lived in a typical subdivision outside of Frankfort, Kentucky called Cloverdale. I guess all subdivisions during that period searched for names that were pleasant sounding so that the people would believe that they had made it because they were able to buy a house in the suburbs and live out the American dream. But the American dream never seemed to be able to catch the Fox family. We moved too much for that dream to ever have a chance to catch us. Take a new job, move. Take a new job, move. Even with the same job, rent for a short time and then move again. I lost count of how many times I had to change schools. Cloverdale was a bus stop of rental houses that gave me enough time to make a few friends, collect some comic books, go to a different school, and then fall off a cliff. Cloverdale was located in a part of Kentucky that had rugged areas that held deep ravines, steep cliffs, and caves. A 20-minute walk from my house would put me on a hillside that grew steeper as you walk down until you came to a barbed wire fence. That was supposed to warn anyone that you should probably not go any further as the terrain got steeper and ended at the edge of a large cliff. But if you got close enough, you could look over the cliff and see that the drop was quite long. was steep, sloping ground that continued for perhaps 60 yards past trees and brush until it ended in a creek bed that flowed quite well in the summer. But this was January. I was 10, halfway through the 4th grade, and still on Christmas break. I remember it was a Monday, and I had big plans for an adventure that had been on my mind for weeks. My plan was based on the water that ran over the cliff and froze into huge, long icicles. My parents did not believe that some of these icicles were 4 or 5 feet long. So I decided to prove it to them, chop one off as high as I could reach, and bring it home. Well, there were 2 other boys from Cloverdale who had agreed to come with me that day, and we had spent a considerable amount of time planning our day. I had an old Army canteen that hooked to a web belt filled with water, and a short hatchet to chop off the icicle. Little did I know that those 2 items would come to save my life. Monday, I called my 2 friends from the kitchen phone, and they both bailed on me. Lame excuses. I was really mad and decided that, I'm going to complete this adventure on my own and make it back with a long icicle as my reward. It was very cold that day, so I waited until after lunch to let the sun warm up things a bit. About 2 in the afternoon, I struck out, telling my mother that I was going to play at one of my friends' houses and be back in time for dinner. I left the house and hiked across the fields to a lot that ran down a hill to the cliffs. I passed 2 houses that were built close by and did not realize at the time how important one of those houses would become that day. I crossed under the barbed wire fence and took my time threading my way down a path beside the cliff that led to the mouth of a cave burrowed into the cliff face. It was here that water flowed down and froze into long icicles that from a distance must have looked like the giant teeth in a monster's mouth. I climbed up a large rock in the mouth of the cave, and reaching as high as I could, I chopped off an icicle. It looked really big to me, but I guess it was really only about 3 feet long. But it was my prize, and I was proud of myself. My adventure was almost complete, and as I started to climb back up the path to the top of the cliff, I felt a kind of sense of power and accomplishment that I had done this on my own. I suppose it was this sense of accomplishment that caused what happened next. I remember standing on the cliff, looking out over the trees and the creek bed. It was quite beautiful as the afternoon sun peeked through the leaves and gave the surroundings a golden glow. It was then that I looked right at a long vine that stretched from the base of a huge tree up into the branches, finally disappearing into the sunlit leaves. It was secured to the base of the tree trunk with a small rope that was hooked around a nail. I remember that the vine was about as big around as the handle of a rake or shovel, certainly thick enough to handle the weight of most boys. During the summer, we would come down to the caves to explore and play, and it was during one of those trips that I first saw some of the boys pull the vine off the nail, grab hold, and swing out over the cliff. They would stand on a large flat rock near the edge and then push off and become airborne for a few seconds. I would watch them with envy, but I never had the courage to even attempt swinging on that vine off of that cliff. It scared me so much that I just ignored all the other boys when they tried to talk me into trying it. You see, I was not very tall, and I was overweight with thick glasses, so I was not exactly the kind of kid that took those kinds of chances. I was not very athletic or strong, and was certainly afraid of that vine and that cliff. It made no sense that I would attempt to swing on that vine at all, especially when there was no one there to egg me on or even witness what I had done. To this day, I don't know what possessed me to make that trip by myself and do that stupid act that almost killed me. I don't know. Maybe it was to prove that I was not really the boy who was overweight with glasses, picked on and bullied. Maybe it was to prove to my parents that I could do something big and interesting, so they would pay attention to me. A 5 or 6 foot icicle was certainly big, and I thought it was definitely interesting. But the grapevine, that really made no sense because there was no proof that I had done it, unlike the icicle. No, that part was totally on me and my wanting to prove to myself something, as foolish as that turned out. For whatever reason, I put down the icicle, walked over to the tree, and removed the vine from the nail. I stepped over to the large flat rock and carefully stepped up while holding the thick vine in my gloved hands. But my gloves proved to be my undoing that day. But my other clothing saved my life. It was about 15 to 20 degrees, and even with the sun out, it was a cold day. So I dressed warmly in jeans, t-shirt, a sweatshirt, and a thick winter jacket. I had on sneakers and a stocking cap and gloves that were stuck into the pockets of my jacket. I knew I would need them to hold the icicle as I chopped it off and carried it home. Around my waist was buckled an old Army-issue web belt, and attached were my canteen filled with water and my trusty hatchet. I don't really know why I carried the canteen, but it did balance the hatchet, and it was cool to wear, like a soldier, I guess. I remember being scared, but I knew that if I hesitated and thought about it for just a second, I would chicken out. So I held my breath and pushed off as hard as I could and swung out over that cliff. I swung all the way out and came back. Yes! I made it back as I felt my feet touch the flat rock. It was then that I slipped on the rock, lost my balance, and started to fall forward off the cliff. I still had the vine in my left hand as I fell, and managed to reach up with my right hand and grab the vine as I once again swung out into space. But I could not get a good grip with my right hand in time, and both hands slipped out of my gloves. I distinctly remember seeing a flash of green before my eyes and the sun still peeking through the leaves as I fell. It must have happened instantly, but it seemed to take a long time. Then everything went black, and I must have passed out. It turned out that I had fallen 75 feet because the local newspaper sent a crew out to measure the distance. I was called Tarzan by the reporter, and the name stuck. The whole time I was in the hospital, the nurses would come by and say, "So how's our little Tarzan doing today? Why didn't I die in the fall?" There were a number of things that played out in my favor. The ravine was a steep slope, so I didn't hit on level ground. Apparently, I fell through a brush pile, and luckily I missed the bigger limbs, and the thick leaves and smaller branches broke my fall to some extent. Then I came through the brush pile and rolled down the hill until I came to rest near the bottom by the frozen creek bed. I don't remember much of this part of the story, but after talking to the police and fire crews who rescued me, it was the reporter who told my parents this part of the story about the ravine, the slope, the brush pile, and where I rolled down the hill. What happened when I woke up? Well, I realized I was in big trouble. But all my 10-year-old mind can think of was getting home, and I didn't realize I was injured. So I tried to stand up and walk out of there. It turns out I must have pulled my left leg up while I was falling, and as I crashed through the brush pile, I hit the side of the hill, mostly with my right leg. This crushed my femur into many, many pieces. When I tried to stand, my right leg collapsed, and I fell back down onto a sitting position. It was then that I looked down and noticed that my right foot was pointed backwards, and my leg was much shorter as my right foot was about where my left ankle was located. When I had tried to stand and put weight on my injured leg, I pushed the lower part of the femur up into my thigh, and I could see that it was pushing against my skin, and I could feel the sharp end of the bone through my pants leg. What I did not know is that it was pushing up against my femoral artery, and if the bone had severed this artery, I would have bled out in minutes. I really didn't know about the danger to the artery until later, when I was telling my story, and the doctor told me what could have happened. Initially, it's funny, there was no pain. I was probably in shock, and the cold, and the rush of adrenaline, but nothing hurt at that moment. That would change very soon, as the side of my leg caused me to panic. I started to cry and scream for help, but my words seemed to disappear into the trees, and no one came to help me. I screamed and cried until I ran out of breath, and my voice was reduced to a croak. Then I remembered my canteen of water. My mouth was dry, and I thought, if I could just take a quick drink, I could continue yelling for help. As I drank some water, I remember a sense of calm coming over me, and the thought that I was here on my own, and no one was going to save me. I knew this because I was so deep in the ravine and so far from any houses. So I closed my eyes, took some deep breaths, and tried to make a plan to get home on my own. How did I go from total panic to planning a way to get home? Honestly, I don't know. Maybe because I was a kid, anything was possible. If I could see it in my mind's eye, I could make it happen. A kid really has no preconceived notions about what will work or not work. Doubt was never a problem for me at that point because action never let doubt get the upper hand. So I focused on my leg and decided I had to get it straightened out or bad things were going to happen. I think in my 10-year-old mind, I needed to fix my leg before I could go home. I reached down and tried to pull my foot back straight, but the pain was so bad that I had to stop. I pushed on the part of the femur sticking up against my jeans, and again, the pain hit hard, and I lay back on the ground, gasping for breath. I thought about it for a while and then realized that I needed to pull my leg from the foot to get the bone to go back into place, but I couldn't reach down and pull. Somehow I needed to secure my foot to something, and then maybe I could scoot up the hill, and that would pull my leg down the hill until the bone snapped back into place. Then I could straighten my foot. So I needed something to secure my foot, and I saw a small sapling near my right foot. If I could tie my foot to that small tree, I could scoot up the hill while pushing on the bone and maybe get it to be normal again. I could also reach up to other saplings with one arm and pull. So by pushing on the bone and pulling myself up the hill, maybe I could fix my leg. But it hurt so bad to touch that I knew I would have a hard time pushing the bone and pulling my body up the slope. So I decided to pour water from my canteen over my leg in hopes that it would freeze and deaden the pain enough for me to fix it. I poured some water on my upper leg, took a quick drink and set about figuring out how to secure my foot to the small tree. I did not have any string or rope, and I remember looking at my shoestrings, but I wanted my shoes to stay on so I could walk home. I really thought I could fix my leg good enough to walk home. I know this was my 10-year-old brain thinking this, but I think I believed it. So I pulled up my jacket and looked at my sweatshirt and noted that the bottom material formed a thick band. So I took off my jacket and sweatshirt. This took a while and some wiggling around, and I realized that the water freezing on my leg was working as the pain was a lot less. Using the blade of my hatchet, I cut through the band on the bottom of my sweatshirt and ripped it off all the way around. This gave me quite a nice rope. I used this to tie around my ankle and to the small sapling next to my foot. Then I began to pull myself up the hill using my hands and bottom until I could reach another small tree above me on the hillside. I grabbed that tree and pulled with one hand as I pushed hard on the bone to get it to move back into place. Then I would pull with both hands and slowly move up the hill, and the bone moved down the hill. This took a long time, and I had to pour more water on my leg several times to deaden the pain. I screamed out loud with every push and pull, but I was determined to get this part of my plan right. Eventually, I heard a weird pop, and my foot appeared to be about level with my other one, and the lump in my jeans was gone. I reached down and straightened my foot until it was pointed up in the direction that it should have been. To say this was easy or not painful would be a lie. I remember gritting my teeth, crying, grunting, pushing, pulling, yelling, and screaming in pain as I struggled to fix my leg and go home. Honestly, I don't know how I devised a plan and a method to do this. And with the pain and the freezing temperature in the water, I was 10 years old with no experience or training. The accident happened on a Monday. And on the Sunday night before, I had watched Timmy and Lassie help the pilot of a small plane that crashed in the forest. After helping the pilot out of the plane, they discovered he had a broken leg. So Timmy helped the pilot cut up some small limbs and make a splint for his leg. From that episode, my 10-year-old brain knew what I needed to do next. Make a splint for my leg, just like Timmy had done for the pilot. So I chopped up some small limbs nearby, put them on both sides of my shattered leg. Then I untied the sweatshirt rope from my ankle and tied it tightly around the leg and the splints. I also cut the neck portion of my sweatshirt apart and tied it around my leg. When I had done all I could to fix my leg, I was very cold and completely exhausted. I remember that I had difficulty getting my jacket under me and back on, and I was really tired at this point. So I poured more water on my leg, lay back on my torn sweatshirt, and pulled my jacket as best I could over my body. As I lay there, I realized that even though I had apparently done a decent job on my leg, I was not going anywhere. I understood that I could die here from the cold. As the afternoon turned into evening, it got colder, and I was freezing to death. But because I was so cold and the water had frozen my leg, I was not in pain. I think if this had been warmer weather, I would have given up because the pain would have been so great. But I refused to give up. But then falling asleep became my biggest danger. As my body temperature dropped, I was at risk of dozing off and never waking up. The air was cold and the frozen ground was sucking my body heat through the sweatshirt and the jacket. I must have dozed off because suddenly I became wide awake and started screaming for help. And that was my life for the next time, I don't know, maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours, I don't know. Call for help, drink water. Call for help, drink water. Squirm around so I would not get too cold. Try not to pass out. Try not to give in to sleep. I remember at one point just starting to cry, and I yelled at myself, stop crying, it does no good. Just yell and maybe somebody will hear you. Just keep yelling. Maybe you'll be missed and someone will look for you. Just keep yelling and yelling until someone comes. Why did I not give up at this point? It was simple. I wanted to live. I know that sounds like a simple explanation but to a kid, it was a simple desire. I wanted to live so I could go home and eat dinner and crawl into a warm bed. And I could not give up if I wanted that to happen. I needed someone to hear me. And in the end, someone did. A young teacher working late who lived in one of those houses I described near the fence. A teacher who heard my voice and at first thought it was kids playing tricks because they had done that before, crying wolf. He heard me. He came down to the edge of the cliff and said, "Is someone there? Are you hurt?" And I yelled back as best I could, "Yes, my leg is broken. Please get help." And he did. He made it back. It took fire, police, volunteers from the Cloverdale subdivision, doctors. A lot of people came to help me. The first fireman to get to me brought a doctor and warm blankets. I remember the doctor asking me if I was a Boy Scout because of the work on my leg. At that point, my dad had made it down to me, and the doctor looked at my dad and said, he's talking about Lassie. I think he's just delirious. The only thing I could do at that point was look at my dad and cry, "I'm sorry," over and over again. They couldn't get me out of the ravine. So the firemen figured out how to do it. They basically had to tie me to a stretcher, swing a rope over a limb, and then I got to fly again. But this time there was no drop at the end. No, this time they used ropes to swing me back and forth after pulling me up in the air until firemen on the cliff could grab me and haul me in and get me into the ambulance. I had pneumonia in both lungs, a shattered femur, extreme hypothermia, cuts and scratches from the brush pile, and generally was in really bad shape. In the hospital, they put my leg in traction, gave me lots of pain meds, and hoped that I would make it through the next few days. Well, folks, I made it. I realize now that my story was a bit unique. I did do the impossible. I saved my own life. You know, I have lived a wonderful life full of adventures, accomplishments, failures, happiness, grief, love, marriage, children, all the other things that make up a life well lived. It could have ended that day, and I still have huge thanks to a lot of good people and a dog on television. Well, the story doesn't necessarily end there. My leg was in incredibly bad shape, and the only thing the doctors could tell me at that point is that due to x-rays, my femur was shattered into so many pieces that only amputation was the choice. But at that time, a traveling orthopedic surgeon named Dr. Blackburn happened to be in the hospital on consults and heard about my case. He came by, looked at my chart, looked at the x-ray, came and told me that if my parents would give permission, he would like to attempt an operation to glue all the pieces back together and put a metal band around my femur, and then the bone would grow over that over time, and hopefully I wouldn't lose my leg and I would be able to walk. Well, my parents gave permission, and Dr. Blackburn operated on me. I have no idea how long that operation took, but he glued back all those pieces of femur, banded it with some sort of metal band, silver, whatever. And over time, because I was 10 years old and had young bones, it grew over this metal band or metal plate. And to this day, I've never had trouble with my right leg. My whole life, I've been able to do sports and do things and shoot basketball and run. And he saved my life because he saved my leg. And I'll always be thankful to that man that not only saved me when he was coming home and heard me, but also to that orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Blackburn, who saved my leg and allowed me to live a much more normal life. I ended up in a long recovery. It took over a year, maybe even longer, because I had to graduate from a full cast and being in bed, eventually to crutches, eventually recovering to the point where I could walk. I had a wonderful fourth grade teacher who brought my homework every day, and so I was able to go ahead and graduate from fourth grade without having to go back to school. So a lot of things came into play that helped me recover. But it was a long recovery, and when I look back, I now think, that spirit, that drive, that desire to live, that desire to recover and get back to normal, maybe I dug deep and found that spark again during this recovery, all these years later. So I did it at 10, and I'm doing it again at 75. Well, that's my story. Thank you for listening.